Hi there. Previously, I made a video about the meanest debate that I've ever seen. It was about abiogenesis, the idea that there's a scientific explanation for the movement from a universe with no life in it to a universe with life in it. And I walked into it thinking it was going to be a normal scientific debate between two well-educated fellows on a subject that I knew almost nothing about, and instead it was filled to the gills with vitriol.
My question is for both Dr. Tor and Mr. Farina. It's simply put, what is one thing that they admire about each other's scientific career?
Okay, let me start. Let me start. This man has said multiple times that I have called him stupid. I have never called him stupid because I don't think he's stupid. I have said he's clueless on this topic. I have said he cannot read the scientific literature. That doesn't mean stupid. This man has become a musician, and then he went out, and in 2015, he started an educational site, which is huge. Stupid people can't do that. I admire him. This is an educational site. His wife is here. He's a father. He has 2 children. I admire that a man can have a wife and 2 children and stay married and do these things these days. That is wonderful. That is wonderful. I admire that.
I admire the tenacity with which you stick to a script of lies. It's actually quite impressive.
One of the 2 members in particular was more hostile, and I started to wonder why, because the topic doesn't really invite such hostility. So, listening to his arguments again and thinking about it carefully, I realized that he didn't think they were having a scientific debate. He thought they were debating about atheism. The mean guy thought that the other fellow, who was very publicly Christian, was making a God of the gaps argument. He was arguing that atheism is wrong, and so the mean guy became mad and wanted to predominantly insult, belittle, and make fun of the Christian guy. For that specific case, I'd recommend you go watch that video. I got a lot of comments on that section of the video where I put forward that there's some tension between the extremes of people wanting to make God of the gaps arguments, wanting to make science of the gaps arguments, and ultimately I concluded that in the case of abiogenesis, I was willing to put my faith in science that unanswered questions would have a scientific explanation. Since people were interested in that, and I got so much feedback on it, I want to expand on those ideas a little bit more and be a little bit more clear. So, my name is Buck Kansas, and here are my thoughts on God of the Gaps and Science of the Gaps. What is God of the Gaps? God of the Gaps is this idea that people improperly use God to fill gaps in our knowledge. Really classic example is the idea that Zeus is the cause of lightning. Ancient person sees lightning and says, that must be Zeus being angry, throwing bolts of lightning down at the ground. But perhaps a better example would be Sir Isaac Newton, who thought that the theory of gravity he had couldn't account for planets being in stable orbits, and so God must be keeping the solar system together. Newton sees a problem with his scientific theory and fills that problem with God. He says, well, God must be making it all better. In researching this, as far as I can tell, the kind of language God of the Gaps comes from Nietzsche. He's got a writing where he's criticizing priests, and he says, into every gap they put their delusion, their stopgap, which they call God. But while the specific language of God of the Gaps might come from Nietzsche, the concept is much older, and actually has historically been popular in Christianity. In St. Augustine of Hippo's Confessions, he talks about Mani, the prophet of the previous religion that St. Augustine was a part of, Malchianism. Mani claimed to be a divine person, and so all of his utterances were true, even when he was demonstrably wrong about the sky, the stars, and the movements of the sun and the moon. St. Augustine points out that that was a problem because he's a divine person, but that he doesn't have a similar problem with Christians being wrong. He says, when I hear of a Christian brother, ignorant of these things or an error concerning them, I can tolerate his uninformed opinion, and I do not see that any lack of knowledge as to the form of nature or this material creation can do him much harm. So he's basically saying, well, if Christians are wrong about how nature works, it's not that big a deal because nature's not as important as the divine things. But then he goes on and says it can be problematic. If he thinks that his secular knowledge pertains to the essence of the doctrine of piety or ventures to assert dogmatic opinions on matters in which he is ignorant, there lies the injury. St. Augustine is saying that if there is an aspect of the natural world on which you are ignorant, and then you dogmatically push God into it, that's a problem. And he expounds on that idea, explaining that it serves as a stumbling block to non-believers. That if they see Christian folk believing things that aren't true, it casts doubt on the whole system. If your version of Christianity requires you to believe that the world is 10,000 years old, but repeatable, demonstrable experiments in science show us that the world is way older than 10,000 years, well, then your version of Christianity must be wrong. And maybe all of it is. This is why historically Christianity has had a lot of doubts about design arguments that the state of nature implies a god. They preferred philosophical arguments historically. So pretty close to everyone is worried about using God improperly to fill gaps in our knowledge. But where atheists and Christians disagree is whether it is ever proper to use God to fill gaps in our knowledge. So what else can we fill with gaps? Well, that brings us to science. So what is science of the gaps? Science of the gaps would be a parallel to God of the gaps, meaning using science to improperly fill gaps in our knowledge. Science is entirely concerned with filling knowledge gaps, and history has shown us that it's excellent at doing so. But assuming science will fill every gap is a level of blind faith that isn't supported by science itself. First, the proposition all questions can be answered by science is itself not a scientific statement. It's a philosophical one. And so if science is the only thing that holds truth, then the statement itself can't be true. But even more so, quantum physics has shown that there are hard limits to science's ability to fill gaps. We cannot know the position and velocity of electrons. Full stop. This is a gap that cannot be filled by science. Although this doesn't necessarily imply that it ought to be filled by God. Indeed, it could be that this is the kind of question that merely lacks an answer. There isn't an explanation for the randomness of the behavior of electrons. It fits within a certain trend of randomness, within some constraints, within some boundaries, but there might genuinely be no explanation beyond that. Additionally, there's questions of morality. Science answers what, how, and why questions. It doesn't answer should questions. Should you help an old lady cross the street isn't a question that can be answered with science. But science can help with should questions by resolving sub-questions to it. For instance, should you believe the world is round? Well, that really breaks down into two questions. One, is the world round? Which science says yes. The Earth is an oblong spheroid. And then two, should we believe true things? That's a moral question. That's a value judgment that science can't get to. So science can be helpful in answering should questions, but it can't wholly answer them on its own. Of course, some people deny that there is any truth in morality. So we can turn to another subject that isn't science, but people broadly agree contains truth. Math. Math is a socially constructed way of organizing our thoughts. Mathematical truths are true independently of reality and aren't inherently part of reality. The number 2 doesn't really exist. These look like two fingers, but that's just how we're choosing to group them, how we're choosing to think of them. There's nothing two about these fingers inherently. It is only our perception that applies the number 2 to the fingers that I'm holding up. It's an abstract idea. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true independently of reality. If we were brains in jars hooked up to the Matrix, you could still say 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a valid thing, is accurate. So there are many areas where science alone cannot give us the answers, where we need other disciplines of thought. But I think it's also important in a discussion like this to acknowledge that it is okay to have reasonable faith in science. There are absolutely gaps in our knowledge that we can reasonably believe will be filled by science someday, even if that's not certainly true. We have gaps both as individuals and as a collective. So individually, I don't know how glass is made into both mirrors and windows. But I believe there's a scientific explanation, and I believe so for really two reasons. One, that's the kind of question that science answers. How do you make glass into a mirror? How do you make glass into a window? How you make things is a category of question that I typically see science answering pretty well. And there's nothing exceptional about those questions to make me think science might be limited. Additionally, the fact that I can buy windows and mirrors and they are tailored to specific applications certainly implies to me that people are making them. They're not just finding mirrors whole cloth in the wilderness unexplained and selling it to me. So as an individual, I think it is incredibly reasonable to place my faith in the idea that there is a scientific explanation that exists for the making of windows and mirrors, and that probably I could Google it right now and find out, and then have that uncertainty cast away. I'm not doing so because I wanted to make this video and I wanted to find a not too embarrassing example of something that I didn't have a scientific explanation for, but still believed in. So I'm not going to Google it. Feel free to explain down below in the comments how you make glass into mirrors or windows. But as a collective, there's also questions that we believe will eventually be answered by science. How do we send a person to another solar system? We don't currently know. We've never sent another person to a planet. And it really could be impossible. We could be stuck in our solar system. But we generally seem to think that it's possible. And I think the reason we believe that is because it's the type of question that science answers. How do we get someone to space? How do we get someone on the moon? How do we get someone to Mars? How do we get someone to another solar system? These seem like the kind of things that science answers because science has answered some of those questions. So it's reasonable as a collective to put our faith in science to come up with an answer. And putting some of our faith in science doesn't mean we have to put all of our faith in science. That's really what I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to highlight the fact that there are different ways of thinking that pertain to different questions, and no one methodology of thought can really get you to all the answers. There's room for more than one way of thinking. In looking into this, I found that Cardinal Cesare Baronius once said, "The Bible teaches us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go." There's plenty of room for religion and science, and there's different times that you ought to put your faith in each of them. And if you put your faith in either of them improperly, your belief might feel threatened. So, I've been Buck Kansas. Those are some of my thoughts. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment down below. It helps out the channel a lot. I want to make another video kind of touching on this, talking about intelligent design, because in that first video I did conflate God of the Gaps and intelligent design, but I couldn't find a way to succinctly talk about it here, so it's going to have to be another argument, another video. Thanks for watching. Bye!